You think Thunderfoot can't be pwned? Just give me 10 minutes of your time.
The Bible says about Moses. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. But how does Moses describe God? He describes him like this. And the Lord went before them by day as a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night as a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could go on day and night. That's bizarre. God almost sounds like a volcano, a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night.
Okay, well I could play you more of that, I wish I had time, but what you get, other than a brief sojourn into the world of plate tectonics, is more of the same. More biblical passages, mainly from Exodus, and then Thunderfoot's analysis, placing it in this context of Yahweh being a volcano god. This is all very enjoyable, but basically it's wrong. What I want to do in this video is to frame this into an historical context and show you that when we do that, Yahweh comes out not as a volcano god, but as a storm god. So the time we're going to be talking about ultimately is going to be the time of Moses, which is the 13th century before the Common Era. Now, according to the biblical scholar Michael Coogan, this was a period where all over the place storm gods seemed to be coming into favour with different groups of people. If you look at this chart, in India we can see that Indra, the storm god, is replacing Dios. In Greece, Zeus, the famous storm god, is replacing Kronos. In Babylonia, Marduk, who in the Enuma Elish is said to have slayed Tiamat, who is associated with sea serpents, something you might like to think about later on in this video, replaces Enlil, and Enki, who later becomes known as Ea. But the people we want to concentrate on here are the Canaanites and the Israelites. It's important to note that prior to the 20th century, not a lot was known about Canaanite religion. It was only in 1928 at a place called Ras Shamra that a tomb was opened and some texts were found, what's known as the Ugaritic texts. Since then these texts have been interpreted and more texts have been found, and this has had profound implications on Abrahamic faith and its origins, and you'll see why as we go through. Now our story actually starts with Abraham himself when he was 75 years old. This was 10 years after the death of his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Noah. And at this point God spoke to Abraham and he told him to get out of his country and to go to a land that he would show him. And this land turned out to be a place called Canaan. Now what we know from the Bible is that Abraham was worshipping a god called El, or Elohim, which is simply the plural version which probably has polytheistic roots. What we know from history is that at this time in the ancient Near East it was traditional to worship the god of the local king. In fact, it was sometimes compulsory to do so. And what we know from the Canaanite texts is that the Canaanites were worshipping a god called El. It seems quite clear. Abraham was worshipping a god called El, living in Canaanite territory under a Canaanite king. Abraham was worshipping the Canaanite god El. And make no mistake, this was before the word El took on a generic term. This was the specific name for a specific Canaanite god. Just to clear this up a little bit more, let me show you another passage, Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 and 19. So here we have a Canaanite king, Melchizedek, and he's blessing Abraham in a Canaanite city, Salem, later to become Jerusalem, in the name of the Canaanite god El. The expression El Elyon doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of Abrahamic faith, monotheistic faith, but in terms of a pantheon, El had 70 sons, all gods. It makes absolute sense. So this is now the orthodox view, that the Israelites were Canaanites, that they were living in Canaan and they were worshipping the Canaanite deity El. But after a period of time things start to go wrong. Famine hits the region and some of the Canaanites, which we'll now identify as Israelites, leave the region and go and live in Egypt while others remain behind. But things don't stay perfect in Egypt for a long time and they fall out with the Egyptians, and another movement takes place. A man called Moses purportedly appears on the scene, and these Canaanites that we called Israelites move back into their homeland, back into the land of Canaan. Now the Bible portrays this as a time of great conflict, with the Israelites ultimately conquering the incumbent Canaanites. But in reality, it's much more likely that this was a cultural conflict rather than a violent one. You see, what had happened is, whereas the Israelites in Egypt had remained true to El, those Canaanites that had remained behind, well, their attentions had drifted, and they'd moved on to a different deity. They'd moved on to Hadad, one of El's sons, more commonly known as Baal. And most significantly, Baal was a storm god. Now this causes a shift of deistic allegiance for the Israelites. Let me read you God talking to Moses. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. Now Moses reports this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and cruel bondage. And is it any wonder they didn't listen to Moses? These people already had a God. They had the old Canaanite god El. But eventually the people relented. Now in terms of the biblical narrative that goes along with this is ascribed to being as a result of these people escaping from the clutches of the pursuing Pharaoh's soldiers. In Deuteronomy 26, you have today declared the Lord to be your God. The Lord has declared you to be his people. Most significantly of all, a passage from the book of Joshua with Joshua himself addressing his people. Throw away the gods, Hebrew Elohim. This is El, the old Canaanite god. Your forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt. Yes, the time they've just had where they've been in Egypt for several centuries. And serve the Lord, Hebrew Yahweh. So what we're seeing ultimately is a process that Mark S. Smith in this book calls convergence and differentiation. The Israelites are converging the focus of their worship with their Canaanite brethren by incorporating characteristics of the Canaanite new god, Baal. But they're differentiating themselves from their Canaanite brethren by maintaining aspects, fundamental aspects of their old god, which they're so reticent to leave behind, El. However, make no mistake, the God that they're now worshipping, Yahweh, the God that Thunderfoot made his video about, is fundamentally much closer to the Canaanite new god, Baal, than to the old god, El. Now I've given you this historical context, let me show you some passages from the Canaanite text and from the Bible that compares Baal to Yahweh, so you can see how similar they are, and you can also see Yahweh's storm god credentials. Okay, so Baal, like many gods of the time, lives on a mountain. Yahweh lives on a mountain. Baal was a warrior. Yahweh was a warrior. Baal dwells in a house. Yahweh dwells in a house. It's important to note here that both in the Canaanite text and in the Hebrew scripture, El dwells in a tent, a tabernacle. Let's move on. Baal defeated the Leviathan. Yahweh defeated the Leviathan. And remember earlier, Marduk defeated Tiamat, who was associated with sea serpents as well. Thunder was in Baal's voice. Thunder was in Yahweh's voice. Baal rode on clouds. Yahweh rode on clouds. Baal hurls thunder and lightning. Yahweh hurls thunder and lightning, not to mention a little bit of rain. In many ways, what Thunderfoot did in his video, although slightly more grounded on planet reality, was qualitatively not a lot different to what some of the writers of the New Testament did when they took Hebrew scripture and moulded it around their Jesus figure, and what modern Christians do when they read Hebrew scripture, strip it, decontextualize it, and strip it of its historical context. I hope now that you've seen the historical context, you've seen the historical situation in the Near East at this time, and you've seen the relationship between the Israelites and the Canaanites generally, that you can see that in the light of this, Yahweh is a storm god. He's not a volcano god. Thank you for watching this video, and remind you that no god ever created by man has proved to be infallible. And even YouTube gods get pwned occasionally.